Alright, so the first thing I want to cover is kind of what this class is meant to do, who it's for, and why I'm holding it. So this class isn't going to teach you how to FC. Learning how to FC is almost always best done actually doing it while being backseated by an experienced FC, preferably one who knows how to backseat well. There's only so much that you can learn just by hearing or reading it, and there's a lot that you need to actually do, because a lot of being a good FC ends up coming from a place of being comfortable with doing it. You will find your FCs who seem comfortable and make really bad decisions. That's a way to be a bad FC too. But a lot of the struggle just ends up being comfortable. I wouldn't say confident, but being comfortable with FCing and making decisions and so on, and we'll cover some of that. Where I expect people to come out after this lecture, like I said, you're not going to be able to just go, all right, and form a fleet and do it unless it comes naturally to you or you're exceptionally brave. I would say this lecture covers kind of a general sense of things that you should be thinking about when you are FCing. The different things that you need to consider and keep in mind when you're doing things like deciding where to go, deciding what to fight, what not to fight, deciding what ships to form, and other decisions like that. And the main reason why I'm holding this class is, one, there seems to be a little bit of demand for it, which is nice. I like teaching people. And especially right now, especially in this time zone, starting from like about now until like 8 hours from now, we're kind of hurting for FCs to do stuff. You guys know that goons have changed their solve timers, so a lot of the stuff is coming out at 0400 to 0800 Eve time, or even later. And there are some FCs, that are awake during these time periods, but having the same guys running multiple Intosis ops every night is kind of killer. So it would just be nice to have a few more FCs in this time period. And that's not to say that, like when I look at the channel, I can see every single one of you guys, as an FC. It's not like you have to unlock some magical technique or role or whatever. It's just people who are willing to step up. So the general flow of this class is going to be, it might sound like I'm reading from a syllabus, and that's because I am. Otherwise I would just forget things or get lost in tangents. We're going to cover sort of sections, and after each section I'm going to ask for questions that relate to that section specifically. After we cover all the sections and do Q&A for all the sections, at the end I'm going to open for a Q&A about the topic in general. And then once the general questions regarding the content of the class are covered, then we can do specific questions about specific scenarios. So if you have a particular scenario in mind, you can ask me and I'll spitball you my best answer for whatever the question is. And then at the very, very, very end, if anyone has just any EVE questions, about EVE in general, or anything in EVE, I'll do my best to answer them. Can't promise that I'll have an answer for everything, and I can't promise that every answer I give will be perfect or even good, but I will do my best. So, the first thing that you want to think about if you're deciding to try out FCing is, what do you need? So, this may be obvious to some, but you need a microphone. The important part, I think, specifically is that your microphone is reliable and that it's not a shitty microphone. If you have like a microphone that doesn't pick up your voice very well, your voice can kind of be lost in the shuffle. Even if you have priority speaker, if your microphone doesn't pick up your voice sharply, it can be difficult for people to hear you over the general melee. I'm sure you've all been in the main channel during some fleets and know how that can go. And you also want to make sure that your mic is, like if your mic randomly cuts out because you have some driver issue or something, it's going to pose problems for you when you're FCing. The same thing goes for your PC. You want to make sure that your PC can handle, a decent amount of people on a grid on the lowest settings without crashing. And you want to make sure that your PC doesn't randomly shut off because your power supply is too low, etc. All these things you need to have a reliable connection. And the same goes for internet connection. So I wouldn't FC on Wi-Fi Definitely wouldn't FC on like a tethered phone connection. You want to have as reliable of a connection and a setup as you possibly can. So the other thing that you need to bring with you is an attitude, a good attitude. The number one thing is to stay positive. You don't want to, basically, when you're in a fleet, depending on the level of expertise of your fleet members, they're going to be looking to you to a certain degree to figure out how they should feel about a situation. So it's like when if a child falls and hurts, or falls down and scuffs his knee, and then looks at the parent, and if the parent says, you're fine, rub some dirt in it, a lot of the times the kid is like, oh, okay. But if the parent is like, oh my god, are you okay, then the kid starts crying. So it's kind of like that. You want to try to maintain a positive attitude, because if you start getting negative, then your fleet is going to feel that way, they're going to not perform as well, they're going to lose confidence in you, and that's the last thing that you want. In that same vein, you need to be fairly forgiving, especially in Horde, and especially right now, because we have over 7,000 people in the Alliance, and a heck of a lot of them are very new to the game. So people are going to make mistakes. People are going to boosh half your fleet off for no reason with Command Destroyer that they just figured out how to use. You're going to have people bubble your own fleet when you need to be chasing someone else, or when bombs are incoming. You're going to have people who don't align. You're going to have people who jump through a gate before you ask them to. You're going to have people who get lost and don't say anything until they're 4 systems away, tackled by something. These things are just going to happen, especially now, but they're always going to happen. And yelling at people is not going to fix that problem. At the very best, it fixes the problem for one person, or maybe people who are listening. But at the very worst, it turns that one person and anyone else who's listening away from you and possibly away from the game. And that's the last thing that you want. Another important factor is to stay as calm as you can. There are certain FCs that you probably know who get really excited, and a lot of a reason that works for them is because they're actually very good. So like, when you have Travis that's just popping off, like, it doesn't shake you because you know you can trust that guy. I mean, yeah, he'll get the fleet bombed occasionally, but in a general sense, he's not yelling because he's losing it. He's yelling because he just yells. When you are just starting out, unless you're like yelling as a joke or something, and even then make sure it's funny, you want to try to be as calm as you can, because people, especially when you're a new FC, are going to be looking to see, how comfortable is this guy right now, because that's about how comfortable I should be. So just try to maintain your calm as much as you can. If you have someone backseating you, flip out in a whisper key in the command channel, but when you're talking to the fleet, try not to get too excited. And the last thing is kind of a combination of the rest, is just to be patient. You're going to have a lot of situations that don't go your way. You're going to have situations where you feel guilty or inadequate. You're going to have situations where your fleet disappoints you, where maybe people that you've given responsibility to in your fleet disappoint you. And all that stuff is just going to happen over time, and it's going to go away slowly, some of it, as you get more and more experience, and as you get better and better. But trying to go too quickly into a place where you're not comfortable, or trying to make things happen more quickly than the fleet can provide, it's never going to work out. So just try to be as patient as you can. So does anyone have any questions or comments about your stuff that you need physically to FC, or the attitude that you bring to the table? Alright. Usually no questions there. No sociopaths in the class today, I see. Very nice. So we're going to cover a few topics, and I'm just going to go over the topics real quick. Like, in order, just so that you know what topics we're going to go through, so that if I haven't gotten there yet, you don't ask questions about it yet. So first we're going to go over general game movement and UI, basically how you physically interact with the client. Then we're going to go over how to think about the doctrine that you want to call. We're going to go over what it means when you look at the fleet composition you end up with and how that can affect your decision making. We're going to go over knowing the area that you're operating in. We'll go over the enemy fleet if there is one, which is kind of the inverse of your fleet. And then we'll go over the capability of your fleet members and individual responsibilities. So in terms of actually interacting with the client and what you need there, first thing you need to do is form a fleet. There's a couple different ways you can do that. You can right click on your own name and choose Form Fleet With. You can open up your fleet window and click what I will refer to as the hamburger menu in the top left of the fleet window. And in there will be a button that says Form Fleet. Now you always want to, you generally want to turn Free Move on, which is in the same menu. When you're the fleet boss, you'll see a option in there that says Set Free Move. When you do that, people will be able to drag themselves into the squad commander positions. They will not be able to drag themselves into the wing command positions. That is something that the fleet boss will have to do. And note that if you are the fleet boss, it doesn't matter where you are in the leadership structure. Like if you are in a squad member position, you'll still be able to drag people around. And another little good little convenience is in that same menu. If you click the hamburger menu, there is an option that says Store Fleet Composition, or Store Fleet Setup, rather. And anytime you store Fleet Setup, it basically will save all the wings and squads in your fleet with their names, and it will also allow you to save the message of the day of the fleet, and whether free move is on or off, and the voice settings in the fleet. So what I recommend for most people to do is just go into, form a fleet with yourself, fill it up with wings and squads until it's completely full. You have to rename the wings to save a fleet setup, so you just rename the wings. You'll notice in this fleet, then I have wings named Alpha Bravo, Charlie Delta Echo, and then just save turn free move on and then save that so that you know that every fleet you create is going to have the max amount of wing squads and free move is going to be on already. And the other thing to keep in mind is when you are using a fleet setup, which you can, in that same hamburger menu, once you store a fleet setup, there'll be a drop-down menu called Fleet Setups that you can pick which one. Always make sure you throw yourself into Fleet Command before you load the setup, because it will not overwrite properly, create the fleet or the fleet setup that you're retrieving if you're sitting in one of the positions that affects it. So always throw yourself into Fleet Command before you load a fleet setup. So the next thing that you want to take a look at when you're sort of setting up your UI for trying out FCing is your overview setup. There's a few things that I pretty much always want on my overview, in addition to the usual, like type, ship type, ship or pilot alliance, etc. Obviously you want distance because you need to know how far away things are from you. Velocity, just straight velocity, is good as well, because I can tell you very quickly if a ship is, if one ship in a blob is just sitting still, or if you're looking at hurricanes and you see, okay, they're going 1.5 kilometers per second. They are clearly micro-warp driving. And the other thing is angular velocity. Now, I normally have angular velocity on my overview, but not shown because it takes up too much space for me normally. You can have it shown all the time, but I normally have it added to my column setup, but I sort of drag the window so that it sticks off to the, goes off the screen. And then if I ever need it, then I can just drag my overview out a little bit and it shows up. And what angular velocity is it's a result of a computation that takes into effect the radial velocity and the transversal velocity of the enemy ship. So radial being how fast something is approaching or going away from you, and transversal being how fast it is moving on sort of a perpendicular axis to you. So those numbers together essentially equate to the ship's movement compared to your tracking of your turrets. If you look under any turret statistics, you'll see that it has a tracking speed of however many rads per second. and that the angular velocity is the number that you would compare that to. So if I was, in a fleet, if I was in a situation where I was having a really hard time, my fleet was having a really hard time tracking enemy targets, I might start looking at that and see if, maybe there's someone in their fleet who's got his orbit set a little wrong, or, has a micro warp drive on and is doing a little bit of a funky, flight path that's allowing us to get better tracking on him. And then you can, use that information to your benefit. Not very often, but I think it's good to have on there. The next thing that you want to do is make sure that you use your tabs effectively. I always like to have one tab where I can basically see everything, everything hostile, I should say, or non-friendly. I also like to have a tab where I can see everything friendly only, so that I can, at a glance check like which ship is this pilot in, without having to open up like my fleet composition menu or anything like that. And then I also like to have, for the remaining tabs, having just drones is a good one to just have, because sometimes you want to kill just drones. Having a tab that is just sort of special ships that you need to watch out for, so like interdictors and command destroyers. You can have tabs that just show like frigates, so that if you're flying like rapid light caracals, you can really quickly just call primer and all the small tacklers. And there are many, many other situations that you can use those for. Another thing you may want to consider in terms of sort of the game client is having sort of bookmarks for certain areas, common areas that you're operating in, areas that you're heading to, later on in the day for a specific op. Having your own bookmarks is a really good idea, because then the enemy doesn't have them. If you use corp bookmarks, the enemy will not necessarily always have them, but they certainly always have access to them if they want them. So having your own bookmarks is definitely a good idea. I also like to have things like anomalies on display in space. Basically anything that you can right-click warp fleet to is a good idea to have enabled in space as well.
I don't know how people have FC without bookmarks. That's crazy.
So the next thing we'll cover is anchoring types. So different FCs may like different things. Some of them will just say anchor and let you do what you want. Generally, there's 3 ways to do this. You can either do an orbit at a range. Orbiting at a close range is a good idea when you have like bigger ships. When your fleet has a mix of ships that some are slower and faster. Basically, orbiting at close range will keep your fleet close to you, will keep your fleet aligned usually behind you. But if someone does catch up to you, or if you get slowed down, your fleet will still maintain some amount of speed circling around you. Keep at range is good if you are, I should say orbiting close. We've explained orbiting far. Sometimes FCs will ask you to orbit at like 30 kilometers. And usually that is because there are bombers in the area, so we're basically spreading the fleet out so that if bombers come, it's not as easy to hit every single person in the fleet with a stack of bombs. Obviously, you lose some effectiveness in terms of your effective range there, because your fleet is spread out to the point where fleet members in the back are not going to have the same range as the ones in the front, and so on, because they'll be in different spots. You can also use keep at range for anchoring. Keep at range is kind of similar to orbit in some ways, in that it doesn't, your fleet won't bump into you usually, but it's a little bit better for keeping people in line behind you, because when a ship that's faster than you catches up to you, generally the game will just automatically slow it down and keep it behind you. This isn't, I don't think it's super useful in a lot of situations. It can be in certain situations, like for instance, if you're in a setup where your logistics is holding completely fine, and the problem that you're encountering is that you can't track your enemy well enough to do the damage you need, you can order your full fleet to keep at range on you at a certain distance, and then you can just stop your ship and basically, all the ships will stop in space around you at a certain distance, and that will give them better tracking because the ship they're not moving, only the thing they're shooting at is moving. But that's pretty rare. I've really only ever seen that become useful a couple of times. The other anchoring you can do is have people anchor by approach. I personally like this for doctrines that need to warp quickly and often, because when you anchor by approach, it actually kind of like removes the hitbox of the ship that you're flying in to an extent. At least other ships that are anchoring by approach, you'll see the ships will all kind of merge into each other. And it's a really good way, especially for ships like with micro warp drives, so like cormorants, for instance, I always have anchor by approach if I have them anchor at all. And that keeps them kind of all squished up together and aligned closer to you. So it keeps people aligned, but also really close and in a ball to you. The other option you have, sometimes anchoring isn't the best option. Like I mentioned cormorants, and usually in cormorants, depending on the situation, but a lot of the time I will have them align rather than anchor. So I'll call some celestial as an align point, and I'll broadcast it to make it easier. And that will generally keep the fleet somewhat together. It won't be quite as good as anchoring if you're doing it right, because people will have different speeds and so on. But you will be fairly confident that all your guys are aligned to whatever the point is. So if you do a fleet warp, you'll all be out of there immediately. And the last thing we'll cover in this section is broadcasting targets. There's a couple different ways to do it. You can right-click on enemies and choose broadcast as target. You can do the same thing for broadcasting lines and warp 2s on celestials by doing the right-click menu. There's a hotkey for broadcasting targets that most good FCs use, and that's by default it's X. So if you hold down X and then click on an enemy in the overview, or anything in the overview, you'll broadcast it as a target. The thing to keep in mind about Eve is that the hotkeys can be real sketch when you're doing anything else at all. So like for instance, when I'm holding my push to talk key down, a lot of the times my hotkey inputs to Eve just don't work properly. So usually when I'm broadcasting targets, that's all I'm doing. I'm not trying to key up. I'm not trying to open any windows or click around and pilot my ship or anything like that, because it can be a little unreliable. An important thing to do also is to try to have your history tab for your fleet open, like you were a fleet member, so that you can see for sure when your broadcasts go through. And then if you X-click on a guy and look over and his name is there, you know that you're good, and then you can call him as the primary vocally. Alright, so that covers that section. Anyone have any questions on general movement, UI, interacting with the client, etc., or anything that I covered here? Oren, if you're talking, I can't hear you.
So if you said fleet warp was this is Chief Poke. You said if fleet warp is right click and then instead of drop down, instead of warp to this location, your an option is fleet warp if
Yes.
you're FC.
Yep, yeah, if you're in any command position within a fleet, if you're even a squad leader, if you right click on anything you can warp to, you'll get a second option below that that says warp fleet to, or warp wing to, or warp squad to, and then you'll get the same options of at a distance, etc.
Thank you.
And you will accidentally click just warp to plenty of times when you first start out, and you'll just warp yourself, and that's totally normal, and it happens to literally everyone, and most people still do it all the time.
But you said you did not have to be the fleet commander if you were the fleet boss. If you're the fleet boss, you better be something that can warp a squad or warp a wing or something like that. Otherwise, you will not have access to that, right?
Correct. The fleet boss is sort of like the administrative tag within the fleet that allows you to change the fleet settings, create squads, wings, move people around, and so on. But the actual fleet wing and squad command positions within the fleet menu itself is what gives you access to those extra warp commands.
Now, those extra warp commands, that's where it's important to have squad commanders and wing commanders, right? Because if you're the fleet commander, you don't have those.
No, you do. When you hit fleet, it warps literally everyone.
Okay, cool.
Yep. Squad and wing commanders are. It depends. Sometimes, like, if you have cool dudes in wing command who are awesome, like if you get headshot, you can just say wing commanders warp wings to whatever. and they might be able to do that, but I would never rely on people for that unless I knew them specifically. Yeah, Oren Rex asks, when you broadcast a target, does it need to be targeted? And the answer is no. Anything on your overview that you just hold X and click on, it will broadcast it as a target.
Thank you.
Any other questions on that section? What kind of roles/situations would you want people to flag themselves exempt from warp? That is a good question, Isiet. I normally would have interceptors flag themselves exempt because sometimes they'll be operating as like a warp out ping on a grid, and when I move the fleet within the grid, I don't want them coming back to it. Sometimes the same thing goes for dictors, although if they're cloaked, they won't take fleet warps, so normally that's not super important. If you have certain utility ships that warp slower than the fleet, sometimes they might want to exempt themselves, but if you're moving the fleet together, you probably want to stay with them. Pods can slow your warp down, because pods don't have a very fast warp speed, neither do noob ships. So pods and noob ships is a good idea to have them exempt from fleet warp, if they become a pod. Especially if you're in like fast ships. Like if you're running an interceptor fleet and you lose a guy, and he doesn't exempt from fleet warp, he's going to slow everybody else down. Because your fleet does warp only at the maximum speed of the slowest member, provided that you're doing like a fleet warp. If everyone warps themselves individually, they'll go at their ship's max speed. But if you initiate a group warp of any kind, you'll travel the slowest, or the speed of the slowest member. Even if your faster ships enter warp first, they will still be limited to that slow speed. Makad Vestine asks, not sure if this is for the section, do you typically find yourself not really attacking yourself, or do you just kind of guide the fleet around and call targets? It depends. If it's a really hectic fleet, I'm just locking up targets and seeing when they die. I'm not bothering to fire my guns usually because I'm too busy anchoring and calling targets and seeing when they die and looking for new targets and making sure my broadcasts are going through and toggling my brackets to see where my friends are, where my fleet is or my logi is and so on. So there's a lot going on it. Usually one extra DPS ship isn't going to make a difference. If we're in a situation where you're just barely not breaking anyone and you're trying to switch targets to find someone who's slow to kill, then yeah, I'll definitely focus more on actually shooting my guns, but most of the time I'm got more important things to do than actually hit F1.
Are there any rules of thumb for calling targets in a certain order, or is it just situational and you just kind of have to learn?
It's situational. Yeah, I would say I'll answer that. Can you write that question down and ask again at the end?
Sure.
Because
sure,
it requires. I'll spend a little time on it, but I don't want to do that right in the middle here. Any other questions about that topic? And if you think of anything else, just write it down on a notepad or something and ask it at the end. All right, we'll move on to the doctrine that you call. So there's some stuff that you want to know about the doctrine that you call. Picking the doctrine is kind of a complicated question to answer a lot of the time because most enemy fleets will have like multiple things that you could run to take advantage of different weaknesses or take advantage of different strengths of both the doctrines that you're running and the strengths of the group that you're in. Like Horde, for instance, one of our strengths is numbers, so there are doctrines which are made a lot better by just having a lot of them, which is most doctrines, but some more than others. But once you've decided on your doctrine, there's a couple things that you need to keep in mind about it. The first one is going to be your sort of damage projection or your range. Now, there is, you have a general sense based on your own skills or based on, the fit and EFT with all fives and so on. But for a lot of the time, with certain doctrines, you'll want to kind of like run an informal poll in your fleet chat. I would say this is important to do with Talwars. It's important to do with Cormorants. If you're just starting out, really you can do this with pretty much anything just to get a good idea. And take a look at the list of the ranges that people type in. And barring any serious outliers, try to pick something that's going to include most people. So if you have like two guys who can, like, let's say you're forming Cormorants and you say, okay, can everyone put their optimal range with spike or iron or long range ammo? in. And you see, 90% of the answers are somewhere between 65 kilometers and, 80 kilometers. Well, and then let's say there's like 3 or 4 people who have shit skills and they can only shoot 50 kilometers. Most of the time in the fleet, you're going to want to be aiming to stay within the majority. Now, there are some situations where you can kind of get in like a mid-range ammo and have your guys with shit skills just use their long-range ammo, or get in closer and have your guys with shit skills use their mid-range ammo and so on. But a lot of the times you don't necessarily want to go for like the average of what you see. You want to go for the number that includes the most people, barring like the real outliers in the set, if that makes sense. So the next thing you want to think about with your fleet is what kind of mobility that you have. You want to know, what your speed is and what your skills are, so that you can kind of make an estimate as to, maybe how fast the rest of the fleet is going to be able to go with sort of middling skills. It's most of the time a good idea to be a little faster than your fleet, because then they'll kind of ball up behind you. So if you're aligning to something, they'll tend to align behind you as well. But you do want to make sure that you're not leaving people like completely in the dust. Sometimes if you notice that there are people that are a little slow, or it's a situation where it's like a really newbie doctrine, like a Cormorants or like a Talwars, or even T1 frigates, doing like sort of swoops with your anchoring to sort of fold back a little bit towards the guys in the back and allow them to kind of catch up a little bit is something you want to keep in mind as well. When you call a doctrine as well, you want to try to think about, what the strengths of that doctrine is and what the weaknesses of it are. Even if you're, probably some of your first fleets are going to be just, hey, let's take out this ship type or that ship type, and let's just roam around. And you won't naturally be inclined to take a critical look at the kind of ship that you're flying, because it'll probably be some T1 destroyer or frigate. And you're just going out to, cut your teeth after seeing and get blown up. But it's still a good idea to, sit back and take a look and say, like, what can this ship do that other ships of the same class or bigger can't do? And what can't this ship do that other ships can? So take, for example, Talwars. Now, Talwars are pretty quick for a destroyer. They're pretty quick compared to some frigates. So you know that you do have a speed advantage in a lot of situations. They shoot a decent range for a destroyer, even compared to some of the long-range weapon types on other destroyers. They shoot pretty far. And the key to Talwars is that they have really high alpha, which means they do a lot of damage and then have sort of a long cycle time on their guns. So you can keep those things in mind and say, well, look, if there's something we can be faster than, then we can kite it. We can run away from it and have it try to chase us. If there's something that has a really short range, we can, use the same logic and just say, well, just stay out of its range, and we'll, blink at it from far away. Or if there's something that, you look at the number of Talwars that you have in fleet, and you do a little napkin math and say, I think we can 1 or 2 shot that thing. Even if it's something that in a straight up long engagement would destroy you. I've seen fleets of Talwars just completely one-shot things like scimitars and almost healers. If you have a fleet big enough, you can alpha pretty much anything in Talwars. And for pretty much every fleet or every doctrine, there's going to be those strengths to sort of put to use. Now, you do also have to consider the weaknesses. The Talwars set up the way that we normally have them are very, very lightly tanked, which means that they're easy to kill, just period. But also, they're harder for Logi to save, because if you don't have a lot of hit points, it can be hard for logistics to heal you in time. They are also, they're Tech 1 destroyers, so they're weak to things like ECM. They are long range, but they have, Tech 1 stats, so their lock range isn't spectacular, so they're very weak to things like sensor dampeners. And if they, if things with like newts get on you, they like Talwars have decent capacitor, but any kind of newt pressure is going to completely stop them dead in the water. And once their micro warp drive's turned off, you lose a bunch of, you lose all your speed, you lose a lot of your defensive ability, because Tall Wars have like a bonus to the micro warp drive signature bloom, so having their prop mod on is kind of a form of defense. And the missiles are delayed damage, so it's completely possible for whatever you're trying to shoot to just warp away before your missiles hit. Those are just some examples of the Tall Wars weaknesses. And you want to try to think about those things, and you won't necessarily know them all at first. But that's something that you can ask your backseat for, or just pull an FC aside at some point and say, hey, I really like the idea of taking this or that ship out. Can you, have a talk with me about what it's good at, what it's bad at, and try to get an idea. So if the composition and the doctrine that you call for is kind of your idea for your fleet, the composition that you end up with is your actual fleet. So the way that you can check this is click on that little hamburger menu in the fleet window, and if you are in any kind of command position, you'll have a little option that says Show Fleet Composition. And I'll take a real quick screenshot of what that looks like. So I put I'll put it in Mumble as well. I put a link in Fleet Chat. And I pasted it into the Mumble chat as well. So when you click on Show Fleet Composition, that's what comes up. What you're looking at is the left-hand column will show everyone's name that's in the fleet. And then the next column, it will show where they are and whether they're docked. So it'll show what system they're in and whether or not they're docked. In the next column, it will show their ship type that they're currently sitting in. The next will show the group that ship belongs to, so cruiser, destroyer, tactical destroyer, interceptor, etc. The next column will show what role they are in the fleet. Most people will be squad members, and then you'll see squad commanders, wing commanders, fleet commanders, and it will say who the fleet boss is. The next column is the fleet skills, which is basically from right to left is their squad, wing, and then fleet command skill. So if you look at my name, you'll see I have level 5 in squad lead or leadership. I have wing command 3, and then I have no levels in fleet command. And that's a pretty good way to identify, who in your fleet has wing command 5 if you're not getting enough people to X up and so on. But I wouldn't just drag people into wing command positions without asking them first. And then the last column there is going to show which wing and which squad that each fleet member is in. This window is kind of like the assets window, in that it only updates itself every so often, but you can force it to update with a session change. So if you ever want to get an up-to-the-minute report on what your fleet looks like, you can just undock and then redock, or jump through a gate, something like that. Anything that causes a session change should refresh that window. So you can close that window, undock, redock, and then open it up again. It will give you an up-to-date report on where you guys are and what they're sitting in. So that's how you sort of check the composition that you end up with. So there are a couple things that you want to consider. Depending on the doctrine that you call, there may be certain support ships that are useful to you, which you'll learn over time. For cormorants, for instance, having a vigil is nice because it makes some targets easier to hit. You want to make sure that you have some tackle. Ideally, you have 1 or 2 dictors. Ideally, you have at least 1 command destroyer if you can get one. Ideally, you want to have about, this is a big sort of air quotes, about a 1 to 10 Logi to DPS ratio if you're running a composition that uses logistics. Something like Tall Wars, you can bring Logi, but it's not super critical to the doctrine. But something like Feroxes or Moas or Caracals, Logi is critical. So in those situations, you want to try to have at least 1 logistics for every 10 DPS ships. A little bit more never hurt anyone. A little bit less depends on what you're facing. If you know the kind of fight you're taking, maybe Logi is not quite as important. But in most cases, you want to have at least a sort of 10% of your mainline ships being logistic ships. And then there's sort of this mattering of you want to try to have 1 or 2 interceptors if you can, because they're the best at going quick and getting to places, burning pings, things like that. And it's good to check and see, like, if you have some crucifiers and you know what you're fighting, you can double check with them and say, hey, make sure you're using tracking disruptors or missile disruptors, and all sorts of other stuff. Or you can check and see, hey, look, there's a guy in a Dominix. What the hell is happening? Why are you in a Dominix in my Tall War fleet? And make sure that he doesn't try to undock that thing and warp around with you. But sometimes you'll see the comp, you'll try to make changes to it as you can as far as asking people to reship, and you end up getting sort of stuck with something that wasn't exactly what you planned for. In those cases, you have to adapt, but it's good to know that information so that you can try to adapt as best you can than to just fly into battle assuming that every single person in your fleet is in a Tall War when half of them are in Atrons or something. Okay, so that's basically it for the sort of doctrine that you're calling section. So any questions? Now remember, I'll handle specific questions about specific doctrines and things like that at the end, but if there's any general questions, I know it's kind of a hard call to make, but if you think you have a question that's pretty general, then go ahead and ask it now, and if it's too specific, I'll tell you to hold it till the end.
So what's the difference between a doctrine and a fit, or is there a difference?
Well, a fit is, a specific way to put, or a specific set of modules to put on a ship. A doctrine tends to mean a group of ships that you would undock together, or that work well together. So for instance, our Ferox fits are just, which modules do I put on my Ferox? But if I say Ferox doctrine, I mean the combination of the Ferox fits, the Osprey fits, and then any of the support ship fits that go with that composition. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
Yeah, for like E-War and stuff like that, is there like a percentage that you recommend having in the fleet?
Not really. I would normally say you would get to a certain point where you feel you have enough tackle, depending on what you're flying and if you know what the enemy is flying, and then just say everyone else. Like E-War is basically like force multiplier, so the more of it you can have and still have your desired core, the better off you are. You don't want to, sacrifice important parts of your core setup, like having no tackle or having no logi for more E-War. But at a certain point when you feel you have enough logi and you feel you have enough tackle, you've got your Dictor or two, you've got your command destroyer if you can find one, and more people are saying, what should I fly, what should I fly? And they can't fly the mainline, DPS or logi. At that point, adding 10 more T1 tackle isn't going to help you if you've already got 10. Usually. Sometimes it can, but I would ask those 10 people, I'd rather have them in, Crucifiers, Molluses, Griffins.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Someone asked, Vorhan asked in chat, what kind of ship should you fly relative to the doctrine you're calling for? Should you be more tanky than your squad members to prevent yourself from being headshot? I would usually say you want to be as tanky as possible. You want to have combat probes in pretty much any ship except for a Tech 1 frigate. You should be able to get combat probes on there, and some Tech 1 frigates you can as well. Sometimes you can do something like you can fit a Tech 3 destroyer to fly at the same speed as Tal Wars, and then if you feel like, you can FC Tal Wars from that, because you can be a lot tankier in that. Some ships it's not quite as easy to do that with, like Cormorants. There's not like a great option for an FC ship for a Cormorant fleet, so it's not just another Cormorant. There are some that you can fiddle with, but I haven't found a great option. Like you can FC Feroxes from Hectors, which are more tanky, from like a Max Tengu. But you always want to make sure you have probes. If you're in anything bigger than a frigate, you can fit probes. You just need to either add code processors in your lows and CPU rigs, and sacrifice. Like my FC Cormorant fit, for instance, just has one gun. So that's all that will fit, and that's kind of all I need because I just need to double check ranges and stuff. But yeah, so you're definitely on the right track there as far as being tankier than your squad members is a good idea, and make sure that you're at least as fast as them. Don't fly a tankier ship that's slower than them. because then people will start running into your butt, and you don't want that. But if you're at least as fast, or maybe a little faster, and you can get tankier and still fit probes, and you're still confident with the ranges and so on and everything, yeah, you can definitely FC in like a harder ship, or a ship that's harder to kill than the mainline ship. Okay, Jan Irvin asked, I got here late, so I don't know what I missed. How do I get into FCing? Do I need permission to form fleets? How can I find someone to backseat me? So there are a couple of ways you can do that. There are certain FCs that create Skybeams fleets. I haven't done it lately, or at all, I think, yet, because I've been kind of running a bunch of ops anyway, and had a little bit of real-life crunch. Basically, an FC will create a Skybeams fleet, and either say he will backseat it and ask for an FC to volunteer, or we'll just basically create an op and ask for both a volunteer and a backseat, which is kind of lame. But in addition to that, you can just create your own op. So you can just go on the forum and create an event at a day and a time, and just say new FC Rome, or call it whatever you want. Say what kind of ships you want to take out. The NBI guys are always around. Most FCs have NBI roles as well, including myself. So we can dip into the NBI hangar and hand out, T1 frigates, or Talwars, Cormorants, etc. And if you want a backseat, I would just say try pinging like an hour before your fleet, or even a day before, and see if anyone's just, throw a single ping in IRC saying, new FC running a fleet tomorrow, looking for a backseat, anyone PM me? And I guarantee you'll get people, because there's a lot of us really do enjoy helping people learn to FC, and it's nice to backseat, because, you get to have your full brain power on figuring out what the best thing to tell the guy to do is, rather than having to both do it yourself and figure it out at the same time. So it's definitely not like an arduous task. You're still doing most of the work when you're being backseated. So yeah, in conclusion, either wait for Skybeams to show up and grab it, or just go ahead and create one yourself. And I would say creating one yourself is probably the fastest way to get out there. Alright, any other questions about your doctrine, etc.? Okay, we will go ahead and move on. So the next section is kind of a short one. It's just about the area that you're operating in. And that's just to bring up a couple points. It's important when you're moving your fleet around to know the geography of the area that you're moving in. The in-game map is like a dumpster pile of garbage dog shit in this respect, so you want to try to open .lan if you can, and that is a website. For instance, I have linked in Fleet Chat, or if you just Google .lan, D-O-T-L-A-N, it's evemaps.dotlan.net, and you can look at any region of the game and see what the actual geography of this systems are. So you have lots of information there. I'm not going to go over all of it individually. There are drop-down menus at the top that can show you lots of individual things about each system. How many rats have been killed, how many ships have been killed, how many pods have been killed, who has sovereignty, if there's a station or not, etc., etc. So if you're out and about in a fleet, you want to make sure that you know where your options are geographically, as far as where you can go, where you want to go, what your alternate routes are in case you run into trouble, which systems have stations in them, if you're near NPC space, where that is, if you're near high sec or low sec, where that is. Just all sorts of things. Having a second monitor is probably the best for this. If you don't have a second monitor, first I would recommend that you get even the cheapest, shittiest second monitor you can possibly get, so that you can at least have something to just put web pages up on. Because when you're FCing, it's really nice to be able to just have a second screen to pull up info. If you absolutely can't, you can load up .lan on like a tablet or a phone, but it's not obviously going to be quite as good. So, one second, I just had a PM from a mentee, just one moment. Okay, and the other thing to keep an eye on is if you're operating in a specific area, knowing certain details can be pretty nice. Like, we're operating in Purebind a lot lately, so knowing things like, oh, XTech7, which is the system that like PL and Waffles and NC is staged in, it's a system that's on the way to Saranin, and it's in NPC space. Knowing that system has like a 200 AU warp from end to end is a good thing to keep in mind if you're going through there. This gives you time to do things like reload, Victor bubble launchers, reload RLML launchers, etc. It's good to know, certain systems that have like gates all together, like very close to each other on grid. And these are little things that you'll pick up over time, but it's something definitely to pay attention to. Checking in the intel channels is also definitely a good idea, regardless of what kind of fleet you're running, just to see if there's anything out and about that people have reported. And yeah, basically just knowing your local area in some detail, and then knowing whatever area you're operating in a general geographical sense is pretty important if you want to be able to make decisions about where your fleet's going, especially if you want to do it quickly. Okay, something. Zero Star Raider says WRT to Intel on Dotland versus the in-game browser. Is the in-game browser worth looking at also, e.g. NPC kills last hour, etc. when roaming hunting? The in-game browser and Dotland kind of show the same information. If the API checking is good, then they should be updated at relatively the same time. Dotland is probably a little delayed, but the in-game browser, I assume you mean in-game map when you say in-game browser.
Yeah, sorry, dude.
That's okay. The in-game map, it's just like spaghetti to me, looking at it a lot of the time. It's like even finding what system you're looking at, like it's a lot easier to just pull Dotland up and flip the drop downs at the top to get the same info, and you get it in a way more parsable format than you do with the in-game map.
Yeah, totally agree. I was just asking about like the up to dateness.
Yeah, I don't find I don't find the delay to be that noticeable a lot of the time, but it can depend, I guess, on exactly what you're doing.
Okay, cool.
If you're someone who's like, I want to go find this one ratter who's active right now, the in-game map might be a little more responsive for that sort of situation, but that's something that you'll see over time.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. So that was kind of the end of that section. So does anyone else have any other questions regarding sort of the area you're operating in, geography, and so on?
I would say pipe systems, like when only like a few gates into where you are. Is it better to set up a is it better to be aware of where you can be piped as well as where you can pipe other people, or can you just sort of wing that depending on your doctrine?
Yeah, it kind of depends. It depends on what you're in and what kind of stuff is operating in your area and what kind of intel that you have. Like I can be pretty certain right now that goons aren't getting anything out of Saranin to O1Y without me knowing about it, just because we have so many people watching in different locations and I'm in a couple of coordinated intel channels. So I'm not like super concerned about getting surprised in a pipe system and getting like wrecked or something like that. But it also does depend, what sort of the state of the situation is. It's always definitely good to know that, but that kind of goes hand in hand with when you're looking at the general layout of the region or constellation that you're in, to know kind of, because you always want to know what your escape paths are going to be. So knowing where the pipes are and where they lead to, where they lead from, especially as well, is definitely a good idea. Any other questions on that section?
At the risk of sounding like a spy, hello. I know Horde has some cool OPSEC things like Pappy Intel and the Horde Spy program. What brownie points do you need to get access to those, and kind of how do you interact with those, or should I just forget about that for now?
I would say if you start FCing, you'll be reached out to in that respect.
Cool, and then I can go tell Mittens all our awesome OPSEC.
Yep.
Awesome.
You know it. Alright, so the next section is the enemy fleets doctrine, and it's a pretty quick section because it's essentially take everything that I said about thinking about your doctrine and just think about their doctrine the same way. Because their FC is going to be doing the same thing. So you want to consider everything about their ships that you've considered about your own. And obviously this is only if you know what they're flying, and especially if you know what the fit is. For a large organization like the Imperium, you can generally just check lost mails on Zkill to find whatever their fit is, because they're probably all going to be flying the same thing. You can check a couple just to make sure. For smaller groups, it's going to be a little harder to suss out exactly what their fit is, but a lot of the time you can get a general idea for what they want to do with a particular ship type, and think about it in the same way that you thought about your composition, and see if there's any adaptations to your tactics or to your fits or anything that you might want to make relative to that information. So the last section that we'll cover is going to be fleet member capability. So there's kind of two facets to this. The first we've already covered a little bit with things like the range and mobility of your ships. You want to try to, when you're actually in fleet operations or in combat, you want to consider, as much about as much things that skill points can change about each membership as you can. So things like cap stability, things like overheating. How if you have really good thermo skills, it doesn't mean that your fleet members are going to. So you need to consider how long you tell them to heat things for, and various other things. Like I said, I've covered a couple of them. I can go specifically module by module, but that's not really useful. It's just a general paradigm to keep in your head. The more important part of this is to develop relationships with individuals and think about the roles within a fleet. So that's things like fleet scouts. Being able to A, trust the fleet scout enough that you know his intel is good. B, get to know a fleet scout enough so that you and he can have enough of a rapport that he knows what you'd want to know and what you don't care about. For instance, if any scout flies with me for a couple of fleets, they'll probably stop telling me about like random interceptors, because most of the time I don't give a shit. We're not going to catch it anyway. I don't really need to know about it. General just interceptor pilots who aren't necessarily scouts. Somebody that you want to try to, basically pay attention to the people that are, when you ask for, hey, can I get an interceptor to X up, and you see people X up, you want to pay attention to those people and try to remember who they are and try to remember who's doing the job well, so that you can, develop a relationship with those people and, ask them to do something specific that that they can handle because you've got a feel for that particular player. Interdictors is kind of the same situation. Getting to know an interdictor pilot well enough to know whether he can handle a command like, hey, give me a stop bubble on that gate, and know that that bubble is going to go where you want it to just by saying that. You can explain to each dictor pilot individually every time exactly what you want from him using 8 sentences, or you can develop relationships and a rapport, and more importantly, with different interdictor pilots to be able to just say those things and know that they understand what you're getting at. And the same goes with logistics anchors and to a lesser extent DPS anchors. And that's just knowing that basically how detailed you have to be with your instructions, and certain things that you may need to say, certain things you may not need to say, depending upon how experienced the anchors are, and how much of a rapport they have with you. The other important thing to consider for this whole section is to try your best to volunteer for and provide each of these roles at some point during a fleet, as soon as you can. You can start FCing without having done so, but in a big fleet, if there's a lodge anchor, or if they need a lodge anchor and you've never done it before, or even if they don't need one, step up and take that mantle of responsibility, because it's going to help you in 2 ways. One, it's going to give you an appreciation for the difficulty of that job, because you'll have done it. And the other is it's going to give you perspective on what that particular role is going to need from you as the fleet commander. So, when I first started FCing, I hadn't done lodging anchoring very much. And then once I had, played as a lodging anchor for a few times after that, I realized that I had kind of been leaving a certain part in the dark for my lodging anchor of telling him when or when not to set up in a certain situation. As a lodging anchor, you really want to know when you land on a gate if the FC, if you don't know the FC very well, you don't know necessarily when he's planning to fight and when he's not. So, knowing as a lodging anchor, I want to be told in advance when to burn off and set up, when to, orbit on the fleet, when to do this or that or the other thing. And the same goes with interdictors, interceptors, scouts, and so on. The more of those roles that you do, the more you'll understand what they need from you as the FC, and the more you'll appreciate the work that they put in. Does anyone have any questions on that section? All right. So, the last section is just basically 5 pillars, I think, of what and this is just this is where we go into full-on subjective territory. So these are the 5 pillars that I think makes good FC, and things that I would recommend that you try to focus on. Sorry, my voice is dying right now. So the first is decisions, making decisions quickly, and never leaving your fleet wondering what to do. If your fleet wonders what to do, they probably think you don't know what to do, and they're probably right. However, if you tell them something to do, then they don't know you don't know what to do, and then they're more comfortable. And then because they're not trying to tell you what to do, you get time to think. So the important thing is to always make a decision quickly, and then you can take a breath, have a little time, evaluate the situation, and then maybe you decide to do the complete opposite thing. If you pay close attention in fleets, you'll actually see a lot of the time the fleet will land on field, the FC will say to do one thing, and then he'll immediately change his mind. And we've all kind of gotten used to that, but what that normally is just the FC saying, okay, we landed, we're going to do a thing, and then he takes a second to look at, what's the actual situation here, and then he goes, all right, well, the other thing would be better, so let's do that instead. So you never want to leave your fleet doing nothing while you're making a decision. You always want to make a decision first, with whatever information you have, as safe of one as you can. Just give them something to do. For instance, when you land on field to start a fight, call a target. Doesn't matter what. If you don't know within the first 1 or 2 seconds who to primary, just primary something that's on the enemy fleet. Maybe it's at a range, maybe it's a really bad target. But once you do that, your fleet members will lock that thing up and start to shoot it. And by the time they realize it's a really bad target, you've called a secondary. And then you just say, okay, switch to the secondary. And then you can go from there. So the second pillar is to always have a plan. This can be as strict as having a specific objective you want to achieve and knowing exactly how you're going to achieve it, or just having certain conditions that you want to meet. So it can be, okay, I want to entosis every iHub in this constellation. Okay, how am I going to do that? I need this much entosis. I'm going to need this much time based on the ADMs in the system. The likely goon, counter interceptor fleet is going to come. What do I need to fight that? What do I do if they bring bigger ships? What do I do if they bring bombers instead, or bombers and interceptors? That you can have a very detailed plan like that. Or it's like, let's take out a roam. Okay, where am I going to go? What sort of things am I going to look to engage? What sort of things am I going to run away from? What is my escape plan? That's very, very important to have an escape plan. Now think about the worst possible thing that could happen to your fleet and what you would do to try to escape that. And then what's the second worst possible thing, and so on. Know where the nearest station you can dock up in is. Know if there are safe towers nearby. or I shouldn't say know these things, but if you can learn them, then keep them in mind, because they will be part of your plan. Think of the ways that an enemy fleet would try to kill you, and try to avoid that. The third pillar is to ask for help. Ask for a backseat every single time until you're totally comfortable doing it on your own. And the very important part of this is the part, pretty much every new FC asks for help. But the biggest mistake that new FCs make when asking for help is not actually listening to the feedback they're given or arguing against it. When you ask for help and a more experienced FC gives you feedback, they're not telling you that you are bad. They're telling you how you could have been better. So you don't need to defend what you did if you're trying to improve. The FCs are not trying to say you had no reason to do what you did and you're terrible. They're saying this is a better thing you could have done and here's why you would have done the better thing. So it's really important, A, to ask for help, and B, to make sure you're open to that help. The fourth pillar is a little related, and that's to leave your ego at the door. We are all shit FCs. I'm a shit FC compared to somebody. Kata is a shit FC compared to somebody. Travis is a shit FC compared to somebody. Your Robert Augustus is just a shit FC. Sorry. Hey, LeMayo.
Not even here. Rip.
Damn. Well, Carl is then. He was here earlier. Carl, you're shit. But no. The point I'm trying to make is that it's like saying I'm the smartest person in the world. Well, A, you're never gonna know that, and B, no, you're fucking not. Like, everyone is bad. It's just different levels of bad, and you're never the best, and you're never perfect. So there's never any reason for you to think that you're the best or perfect. In fact, I think it's healthy to think that you're bad, to an extent, in the search for improvement. If you win a fight, first, feel good. Second, figure out, what did I do wrong? Even though I won, I made mistakes. What are they? How could I have lost that fight? What decisions did I make that worked out? And think about why they worked out. Because maybe you kind of made them by chance and just so happened to dodge bombs or just so happened to, catch the enemy logi or so on. Think about the enemy fleet. Why did they lose? What mistakes did they make? All these things are going to help you improve. The more you focus on the ways that you are not exceeding or excelling, the faster that you will exceed or excel in those fields. So, yeah, I find the egotistical attitude of up-and-coming FCs to be incredibly toxic to their own progress. And I've seen many a rising star burn out before they ever get to, what I think they could have gotten to, because they started talking like a big shot before they had the cred. And even if they have the cred, it's still not healthy. Even the really good FCs in Horde or in other places, like Travis, for instance, sometimes talks some Yang. But if you ask Travis, he'll tell you he fucks up all the time. We all do. We all can, pretty much every fleet that any FC has run, they could have done better. So just keep that in mind. No, definitely don't beat yourself up over things like that. Like I said, it's an improvement and a learning opportunity. It's not feeling guilty or bad about yourself. But just make sure that you tread that line carefully. And the most important thing of all, if I only had to tell, if someone said, give me one piece of advice for learning to FC, I would say that you just need to do it. Basically, suck it up, take whatever you get, and go FC. Just form a fleet, just make an op, just ping. You get your guys. Let's say you get 5 guys. Take 5 guys out. Go in T1 frigates and just go looking for an industrial that you can find somewhere. People play Eve because they want to fly the spaceship. They don't want to sit in the station spinning their ship. If you don't get a lot of people, reship into something that's better for your small group. If you get too many people, then that's awesome. Reship differently. But above all, make fleets, ping fleets, make ops, take them out, fly them around. If you don't get to shoot anything, you don't get to shoot anything. It is not your job specifically to find people content. You want to, but it's your job to form a fleet and tell people, where to warp to and what to shoot when you find stuff to shoot. So if you only get 3 dudes, if you only get 8 dudes, make sure that you're in ships that are appropriate for that kind of fleet, and just go roaming. Go out for an hour. If you're like, okay, we'll roam into Declan. You go into Declan and there's nobody there. Just do a loop at Declan. Give it an hour and then just come home. You haven't been out that long, but people got out and stretched their space legs and talk some shit. You had some space bonding with your horde bros. And the next time you call a fleet, you'll get twice as many guys, because those 5 guys will come back and you'll get 5 more guys. And it'll snowball from there. If there's a fleet on the undock, form a fleet to fight it. Worst case scenario, you lose ships. There's no SRP in Horde, so you don't have to worry that you're not at tier 18 at Horde FC Panda Bear level that can provide SRP for battlecruisers or higher. People will undock what they're okay with losing. If there's a huge fleet out there and you're like, F it, let's just get in a huge kitchen sink ball of frigates and destroyers and try to get them. You try to get them and you eat a wave of bombs and everyone dies, man, that's Eve. And you're the guy who formed that fleet, because if you hadn't, people would just be sitting in station thinking, man, I'd really like to play Eve right now, but nothing's going on. So that basically sums it up. If there are any questions about the sort of pillars that I went over, I doubt, but if there's any clarification, then feel free to speak up now. Alright, and otherwise, if there are any questions, not specific scenarios, but just general questions about anything that we covered in the class so far.
Yeah, Everin, you shelved one, which was how do you prioritize calling targets?
Okay, prioritizing targets. The first thing you want to do is just make sure you primary something, like I discussed earlier. And then there's sort of, it's kind of a hard topic because there are certain fleet comps where, the very first thing you want to do is just start killing DPS. Like if you're against Hurricanes, for instance, they do a lot of alpha damage. Basically, if their alpha damage is equal to or greater than your ship's EHP, then your logistics do absolutely nothing. But if you can get them to below that threshold, then your logistics can oftentimes rep you completely all the way back up and then take another shot or take another volley. So like in that specific situation, I would just start blasting DPS, blasting Hurricanes as quick as I can. Just take as many Hurricanes off the table as I possibly can. In a more general setting, things that are dangerous are things like command destroyers, things like interdictors. If you're in ships that can apply really well to small stuff, like if you're in rapid light caracals, clearing off any T1 frigates or any interceptors that are in range of your missiles before you start engaging the main bulk of the fleet can sometimes be a good idea, just so that you know that you have an easy escape if you need it. Sometimes you'd primary logistics if they're like out of position and their logistics ships are weaker than their mainline ships, and it will help you kill the entire fleet faster in an overall sense. Sometimes there's an FC that you want to primary, and then a lot of it too comes down to positioning on the field. Normally at the start of the fight, when everything is kind of what I would call set up, I will broadcast primaries from the overview list itself. But as the fight goes on more and more, I'll broadcast targets just by clicking on them in space, because I'll see that they're separated from their group, they're separated from the Logi, or they're lagging behind the main fleet, and they're much closer to us, or they're wandering off into God knows where, or it's like a Boucher that landed on top of us, etc., etc. So I tend to transition into broadcasting targets in space, just based on where they're located in terms of, especially with turret ships, because range is really, really important. And beyond that, it just goes down to individual situations and getting experience. Does that sound good?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna take one from chat. Tech Priest says, do you need to know every weapon, range / DPS / tank, ref EHP values of each ship to calculate with your alpha, or can you just go on the fly and learn from experience? It's a matter of you'd want to know all that, but a person would have a hard time absorbing all that information just by studying it. So I would say it's a combination of the two. Having a general idea of what ships are considered tanky ships, what ships are considered good alpha ships, what ships are fast ships, as opposed to knowing the actual numerical values of all of those things is a good start. And then, let's say you do a fleet, and you have a combat interaction with the enemy fleet, and afterwards you want to try to drill down and see whatever the outcome was, why did it happen that way. Then you can take a look at lost mails and fits, bring those into EFT or PIFA, and take a look at the actual numbers and say, okay, well, this is this number's this number's this is why this happened, and so on. So it's kind of a combination, but learning by doing and learning as you go is totally fine, as long as you back that up with research after the fact. Rossoni's Pun says, follow up, what kinds of numbers do you have in your head once you undock and know your own comp? Your total alpha / DPS, lowest warp speed, or other things helpful? Well, I like to know about the range, that we can usually engage at. I like to know about the speed that we'll move at, prop mods on, prop mods off. What kind of cap life I can expect. A lot of our doctrines that use micro warp drives have cap boosters, so that number is basically infinite as long as people fill up on their boosters and you're not in a fight for 3 hours. Total alpha is important for alpha doctrines, so things like Tall Wars, Hurricanes, etc. And if you know what kind of ships you're going to be fighting, and you can look up some lost mails from that group, you can try to get an idea of the enemy EHP. But sometimes that can vary based on fits, skills, whether they have links, how good their links are, etc. But I would say that the main important ones have I covered earlier, just things like range, things like speed. And then a general sense of, if you're in like an alpha doctrine, what kind of alpha you have, and kind of go from there. Okay, Sfeen Mianai says, any advice for a super newbie, let's say 1 month? Well, you put greater than 1 month, but I'm gonna go ahead with less than 1 month EVE experience. Who would love to FC as soon as would be reasonable. Sfeen, I would say that you should get in touch with an FC, probably first, if you have like little to no EVE experience, like it sounds like you do, and confirm that someone will backseat you, and discuss with that FC, what time are you free, what time am I free, and then schedule an op together, so that for sure you have a backseat. I'd certainly be willing to do that, so if you want to send me an email, I can get back to you and we can figure something out. If you have another FC in mind, or you can make a post on the forums, etc. You can always make an op on the calendar and say, I need a back seat. And most of the time that'll be filled, but if you're like very new to EVE and you want to make absolutely sure that you have kind of like an FC mentor, you can get in touch with one of us personally and see if we're able to take that on for you. Okay, Kral Brinknewer asks, do you record engagements to aid in after-action reports and analysis? Take notes, just use your memory. 100% the best thing you can do is record your fleets. 100%, especially from your perspective, not from a fleet member's perspective. Because if you record your fleets, you can upload them as like an unlisted video, and just link them to better FCs and say, hey, can you watch this? And let me know what you find for mistakes, things I did wrong, ways I can improve, etc., etc. And that is absolutely the number one thing that you can do, because even a backseating FC isn't watching how you interact with your game client. They're not watching exactly what you're clicking on or looking at any point in time. But a first-person recording from your screen of exactly what you're doing for the entirety of a fleet is the best way that you can get feedback from other FCs on ways that you can improve, and the best way that you can review your own performance as well.
So that was a super softball, man. When I brought fleets out at the beginning, I know I could barely fucking remember shit. It was like I undocked and then everything was totally fucking crazy and we lost.
Yeah.
And that's useless. If you have a film, you're like, oh, dude, look at that. I can't even click on shit. I need to chill the fuck out.
But I think the hidden best thing to do is to show it to other people as well, because
so true.
They can look at that and say, oh, I noticed that you're right clicking on guys and choosing broadcast target. Like, that's not the fastest way to do that. Or I noticed that you're clicking on a thing and then swinging to look at it. Like, do you know that you can use the C hotkey for tracking camera, things like that. So, all right, any other questions? General questions?
What's your favorite ship to learn to FCN?
Cormorants, 100%. There is no competition in my mind. Cormorant is the best ship to learn to FCN because it will challenge you in almost all the ways that any other ship doctor will challenge you in. Your positioning has to be good or you die. You have to use probes or you won't kill anything, usually. You have to be quick with your warp so you'll die. You have to be aware of your range and the mobility of your fleet, or you'll be ineffective. You have no buffer, so if you make like a decent sized mistake, your entire fleet goes bye-bye. But they're very cheap. They're really, really good. They can punch up incredibly well. They can, there are so many things that a Cormorant can apply DPS to that the other thing just can't even shoot it at all, that you can kill some serious stuff that's way, way bigger or better than you. And people like flying them. It's a fairly easy train. Yeah, I don't think there's any contest personally. However, for your very, very, very first few fleets, Cormorants are probably a little too tricky. So I would normally say starting with something like Talwars or even Kestrels. I would never recommend your first few fleets for you to run like kitchen sink because it doesn't really teach you that much aside from going through the motions of running a fleet, maybe like calling broadcasts and moving the fleet around, but doesn't teach you about how to operate a fleet. Like if you have 100 Talwars, you're essentially operating your entire fleet as one big Talwar, if that makes sense. You all have the same range, the same speed, and so on. And when you're running a kitchen sink fleet, you're essentially saying, this is the primary, and then everyone does their own thing. Or if you make a really bad judgment call, you tell a kitchen sink fleet to anchor on you, and then that is a shit show. So I think the best thing to do is definitely call doctrines, even if it's like Kestrels is a fine doctrine. Micro-warp driving light missile Kestrels, they shoot pretty far. They're kind of like baby Talwars to an extent. And then Talwars, obviously. Talwars are like kind of the staple of noob FC ship because they do a lot of the same things that Cormorants do. They're just not quite as flexible, but they take less skill to sort of put into effect because your range is essentially, are you in missile range or aren't you? And you essentially always have your micro-warp drive on. And you just anchor up and fly around in circles. Chief Poke Alata Twat, nice, asks, for a Talwar fleet, do you still want support ships like Interceptors, Logi, etc.? Interceptors, yeah, definitely. Tackle is good, but can sometimes get killed because you can't really support it very well because you're kind of far away. But you do kind of need to hold people down to actually kill them a lot of the time. Logi is questionable for Talwars because they're kind of paper tank. I mean, they have like a medium shield extender, but it's not that much tank. But it is a really fine fleet for people to learn flying Logi in, like learn how to respond to shield broadcasts and put reps on guys. So I would never discourage someone from flying Logi in a Talwar fleet. I just wouldn't worry too much about your Logi to DPS ratio in a Talwar fleet. All right. Any other questions? We We can move into, like, if you have a specific question, fire away. I will give you the best answer that I can. Or if there are no more questions. Who do we send SRP requests to? That's Grath Telkin, and you have to put in your favorite ice cream flavor.
Something I was wondering, I've been in fleets where they were like expecting 50 people and got nearly 200. What do you do when the mission changes that much? How do you adjust your plans?
It kind of depends. For most fleets that you like form for objective, you just want as many guys as possible anyway. But if you're like, all right, I'm a new FC, I'm a scheduled Tower fleet. We'll take out, some Tower guys. We'll fly around. I'll figure out how this whole warp fleet stuff works. Maybe kill a guy or two. And you do that, and all of a sudden you have 180 fucking Towers in fleet, and you're like, Jesus Christ, what did I get myself into? If you're feeling overwhelmed like that, definitely reach out for a back seat. There's, usually people around to do that. And the other thing to do is just to keep in mind that if you're honest with your fleet, usually, barring some assholes who usually get themselves purged, they're going to be reasonable with their expectations of you. There's no reason that you shouldn't say, hey fleet, this is literally my first fleet, and there's way more people here than I expected. So I'm a little nervous, but I'm going to do my best. And I guarantee you people will be like, you go boy, like go do it. Get some. Because, they didn't score, those 180 people were not brave or courageous enough to schedule a fleet, and you were. You know what I mean? So, kind of just roll with it. Sorry if that's a non-specific answer, but that's kind of the best I got.
No, it's fine. I just was in one, I think it was actually Skybeams, where they were expecting a very small turnout and they got like 200 people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that'll happen lately. You get a lot of people in Horde.
Quick note, don't actually send Grath a mail. I'm sure that's evident. Some people are just so deadpan when they say it.
Don't do that, sorry. Actually, yeah, no, don't do it. Wink, wink, wink. Alright, we've been at this for a long time. An hour and a half. So, I'm going to say, I'll take one more question, if anyone has one. And then we'll call it. And if you have more questions, you can either email, or you can hook me on IRC, etc., or you can ask any of the other FCs and so on. So does anyone have the ultimate question? Carl, don't you do it! I saw that.
Me.
Alright, well, sounds good. Okay, here we go. This is a great question. Great question. Scenario Kitai asks, any tips on bouncing back after you whelp a fleet?
Oh boy.
Oh boy. Alright, so I would venture to say that there's probably no FC alive who's FC'd more than 10 fleets that hasn't lost an entire fleet in a spectacular fashion.
Ugh.
And, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. A, it's unreasonable for anyone in this game at this point to undock a ship and not expect to lose it. Like, that is a mantra of Eve. You never undock what you can't afford to replace. And that, that doesn't apply just to if you're going to do solo PvP. That's like a blanket rule, and everyone pretty much knows that by now. If you don't get to... That's like saying, I didn't know it was against the law to kill humans. Like, you don't get to claim that. It's kind of a known thing. And the other...
It's better to say it at the beginning of a fleet than the end. I think if you remind people that when you're going out versus like, haha, shouldn't undock what you can't lose.
Yeah, well, I mean, I wouldn't point it out that way either. I personally feel it's kind of unspoken at this point a lot of the time. To be fairly honest, I've been playing Eve, for a long time and fairly seriously for the last couple of years. And people who get upset when they lose a ship on an op like that, they're just probably going to bounce from corp to corp as more and more people hate them, or B, they're just not going to last in Eve, because you got to be able to roll with those punches. So normally, like, I'm normally a person in real life and in Eve who says, like, consider other people's feelings, even if you didn't mean this or that or the other thing. You know, like, I'm that guy who says, like, you shouldn't say horribly offensive shit, even if you're not trying to be offensive, because other people's feelings do matter. But in that case, like, people know what they're signing up for. And as long as you're doing your best and you take criticism, you don't have to take criticism from your fleet mates necessarily. You can try, but if they're being dicks about it, like, you know, it's kind of rough though. Sometimes you feel like a piece of shit, especially when, like, you made a dumb mistake and it got everyone killed. Like, well, there's almost no mistake in Eve that you'll never make. And a lot of the times, the way you realize not to make that mistake is to make it. So, yeah, it's kind of a shitty answer, but, like, you kind of just got to roll with it, and just keep in mind that most of the people who died in the fleet are not saying anything because they know what they signed up for, and they're going to be in your next fleet. And not to worry too much about it. And if you're really concerned about it, the very, very best thing that you can do is to talk to a more experienced FC, tell him exactly what happened, and ask him if he has any advice, you know, for what you could have done differently.
I don't know if it was Malinik that used to say, you make almost every mistake once.
I think Malinik used to say, I'm a slimy motherfucker, and I'll take over your alliance.
Hey, now.
Oh, shit. And we're still recording. JK.
Yes, we are.
He had some good shit going on. But yeah, that is essentially, like, Eve and the way that you operate in Eve is not like a natural human, like, logic structure, or, like, it's not something that comes intuitively to humans. So it's basically like you're constantly playing this weird logic and dexterity puzzle. So you can't be expected to do things right every time, especially not the first time that you try them. Alright, so I'm going to call it here. It's been a while and my voice is dying. But like I said... Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you very much.
If you guys have any additional questions, you can email me. If you want to reach out, you can do so in all the various ways in-game, on IRC, on the forums, etc. And I speak for a lot of the FCs, and I say that we're always around to help. I'll be putting a forum thread up in the information, or whatever the appropriate forum is, with this recording and a couple of others that I've done, for one on fleet scouting and D-scan, and one on what to do in a fleet if you're a little newbie. So you can check those out when I get them ready and up there. So, thank you guys all for coming, and hope to see you around, and have a good night.
Thank you, man. This was phenomenal. Have a great night.
Thanks, FC.